I think we are on time. Yes, 3:05 in many different time zones, 5 minutes past the hour, let's say. And we have the next session after the break, which is one of the plenary sessions for this meeting. And this is given by Professor Peter Turchin. And the title is The History of the Near Future. What history tells us about our age of discord. Peter.
Thank you, Panis. Good morning to people in North America and good afternoon to you in Europe. Let's see, let's decide about the technical issues. Is everything displaying fine? Okay, I guess, yeah, I guess it looks like, let me see.
Yeah, we can see you. We can see your monitor.
You can see me. Okay, you can see me, and you can see the slides. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right. So the history of the near future. What history can tell us about the age of discord? 10 years ago, in January 2010, I published a very short article in Nature, in which I made the forecast about political instability through the next decade. In that article, I suggested that the decade from 2010 to 2020 would be a period of growing political instability in North America and Western Europe, with the focus on the United States. This year, 10 years later, together with my colleague, Andrei Karataev, we have revisited this forecast to see how accurate it turned out to be. This article was published in PLOS ONE, so you will be able to get the details, but let me hit the highlights now. What we did with Andrei was to look at several indicators that could indicate political instability. And by the way, can you everybody see the explanation on the right, or do the head shots hide it? Let's see. Okay. Not sure how to get rid of these things, actually. Okay, anyway, I will just explain. And anyway, I will be sharing the slides. So later on, people will be able to see if there is any hidden part of the screen. So what we did here, for example, we are looking for the United States. We are looking for data on two indicators of political unrest: anti-government demonstrations in green and violent riots in brown. So the points, the green points, indicate the number of, let's say, anti-government demonstrations. This point or this point is for the riots per particular year. And the smooth curves are basically lowest smooth curves that indicate the overall trends. So what we see that in the United States, there was a period of heightened political instability during the 1960s, excuse me. We see both peaks in demonstrations and riots. Then there was a period of very quiet, very few of such expressions of instability. And here is 2010 when the forecast was made. So as you can see, the forecast is not a linear extrapolation into the future of the previous trend, because the previous trend was actually a declining trend. But it was based on something which I will explain in a minute. It actually was capitalizing on a trend reversal by looking at nonlinear dynamics governing these types of indicators. The model was actually able to predict a trend reversal. So here now I'm looking at 5 major Western countries from the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Spain. And you can see that for all of these countries, when we look at the incidents of demonstrations. These are anti-government demonstrations specifically. You see that there was a declining trend up until 2010, and then quite an explosion, which has affected all of these countries, and in fact, much broader than that. Now anti-government demonstrations tend to be peaceful. So another, probably better indicator of violence is riots. With riots, we see a similar system. Different countries had peaks of riots at different times. Some during the 1960s. Another one, like Great Britain, for example, had a peak of riots around 1980s. But again, for the 2 decades preceding the forecast, the trend was declining, and then you have the increase. All right, so where did this forecast come from? I'm not a prophet. This was not a prophecy. It was actually a scientific prediction. The purpose of it was not to predict the future, because as we all know, with nonlinear systems, prediction of the future is very difficult, and in reality, accurate predictions are impossible. So the whole point of making this forecast was to make a strong prediction about the future, which would allow us to test whether the theory that we have advanced is actually has any claim for accuracy. The theory is called structural demographic theory. It was first, in its early version, it was introduced by Jack Goldstone in this publication, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, published in 1991. And then it was revisited in a book published in 2009 by myself and another of my Russian colleagues, Sergei Nefedov. So what is the theory based on? The theory considers social systems, well, our societies as social systems with several interacting parts connected by nonlinear feedback loops. And the 3 major parts that we focus on are the general population, the power holders or elites, which are typically a small percentage, 1–2% of the population, and the state. So the state is a separate player, separate agent in this system. So the 3 parts of the social system, population, elites, and the state, are the endogenous interacting parts. And then, of course, we allow for exogenous influences, which could be geopolitical, geoeconomic, or geocultural. So the basic driver for instability is explained on this slide. Fundamentally, we are looking at what happens to the well-being of the population. And we look at such economic indicators as the balance of the supply versus demand for labor. So if for any reason supply of labor exceeds its demand, the price of labor tends to decrease unless there's some other very strong labor promoting institutions. And as a result of the price of labor decreasing, which means basically real wages, the living standards of the majority of the population also starts to decrease. And this leads to what we call, in technical terms, popular immiseration, declining living standards, which could take form of, which have several dimensions: economic dimension, biological dimension. We look at indicators such as the expectancy of life and population height, the stature, which is a very sensitive indicator of biological well-being, and some social indicators. So this leads to mass mobilization potential. The population is in the sour mood, and therefore it is easy to mobilize for anti-government actions. The even more important trend is intra-elite competition. So as the price of labor declines, this money have to go somewhere, and they tend to go to the elites. So they go to capital holders, and people who are employers, so who profit from declining wages of their employees. There also some of the wealth goes towards the high-level employers, highly skilled employers such as lawyers, people working for major mass media, and so on and so forth, politicians, and so on and so forth. So as a result of this trend, whereas the general population begins to be more immiserated, the elites are actually doing very well. But unfortunately, as in any dynamical system, good times cannot continue forever. As a result of this favorable economic conjuncture for the elites, the social mobility, upward social mobility increases, and greater numbers of elite aspirants enter the ranks of the elites. And that starts, it gets to the point where there are simply too many elites competing for a limited number of both economic positions, such as, for example, the top officers of 500 Fortune 500 companies, or political positions. There is only one president in the United States, only 100 senators, and only so many other political positions. So when the numbers of elite competing for these positions increase, inter-elite competition begins to be very stark. And as a result of it, increasing numbers of elite aspirants actually start losing in this competition, and they become potential counter-elites. Those are the individuals who are willing to use a variety of not necessarily legal methods to overturn what to them is the unjust state situation, and therefore we see greater radicalization of the population. In addition to those things, state fragility also increases, first of all, as a result of the fiscal crisis. I won't go into the details because I don't have time. In my talk today, I will focus primarily on the population and the elites, but you can read about this more in my publications. And the international environment also plays a role. So this is essentially the essential engine, the core of the structural demographic model, which explains why societies lose their resilience as a result of these trends, which are all interconnected, and become vulnerable for serious outbreaks of political instability, ranging from mass demonstrations, such as what we have seen this year in the United States, but going all the way to outright civil war and state breakdown, and in some cases, even social collapse. So the details you can see in my book called Ages of Discord, which was published in 2016, just about a month before Donald Trump won the presidential elections in the United States. And we use a variety of proxies to trace, quantitative proxies to trace the dynamics of these three major factors that I talked about, basically immiseration, intra-elite competition and conflict, and state fragility. So because time is short, I won't go into all the details, but as I said, they're all explained, and you can see the details in this publication, Ages of Discord. So let me just show you a few graphics that provide information about how the trends for affecting these different indicators have changed over the past 200 years. So I take the long view, and I'm looking at the dynamics of political instability in the United States ever since the establishment of the Republic, roughly speaking, in 1780s and until now. So first of all, I don't know if you can see the graph on the right. This is the GDP per capita expressed in real dollars in 2005 dollars, and then goes up and up and up, as you can expect. Here are real wages from the same source. This is the real wages of unskilled workers. Here you can see also generally a upward trend. There is some kind of a break point in the 1970s with stagnation and even decline. But what I'm interested in is I'm interested in an indicator that expresses how well the workers, the typical workers, and also the workers. So the typical worker is the median worker, and also disadvantaged sectors of the population, such as unskilled workers. How well do they do in relation to GDP? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide this number by that number and express everything in what I call real relative wages. So relative wages is simply the wages divided by GDP per capita. And what we see here now, we see that there were actually two cycles when you look at the data in this particular way. So first, until roughly speaking, 1830s, relative wages were increasing. This means that workers were doing better than average GDP per capita, so the workers were gaining ground. Then there was a trend reversal, and there was a general decrease in stagnation roughly up until 1910. Then another trend reversal. We have a very strong growth. There was some obviously ups and downs. So here's, for example, the Great Depression actually had an impact, but not as huge as one might expect. We can talk about that. And then another trend reversal in the 1960s. And for the last 50 years, relative wages have been declining. So this means that as economy was growing, most of the fruits of that economic growth did not go to the workers. They went elsewhere. They went actually, as I said, to the economic elites, mainly the employers and highly paid professions. This is why it's important to distinguish median wage from, let's say, top 1% or top 10% of wages, because top wages have been actually going up during this period, whereas median wage was stagnating, as I said, and as a result, the relative wage was going down. All right, so this is quite familiar. The story is somewhat familiar because if you look at the period from 1910 to, let's say, here 2010, we all know about this Great Compression, which we can see as a decline of the share of both income and wealth going to the top 1% of the population. And then there was a trend reversal, which was in the 1970s. And since then, the situation has been increasing inequality. So this corresponds to the second half of the graph on the previous slide. So inequality is one good indicator of this growing economic immiseration of the majority of the population, because it essentially reflects the difference between the top wealth and top income and typical or median wealth and median income. So we can look at, because I don't have much time, and this has been published 4 years ago, you can look at a variety of well-being indicators. As I said, we focus not just on economic ones, so here's the relative wage. We also look at health indicators, which is the combination of life expectancy and average population height. And we look at some social indicators of well-being, the family formation. And you can basically see that they are doing somewhat different things, obviously. But there are these two general waves that we see afflicting the United States. And the periods when these well-being indicators are low, I call them ages of discord, because these are the periods when political instability is particularly high. So we can look at also at elite overproduction indicators, and they are also doing a cyclic thing, but in anti-phase. So if we take a look at, so here's the gray line is basically, it's the PC1, the principal component. It's the it reflects that common trend to all three different different elite indicators. And if you do the same thing for the data on the previous slide, and then now we plot the this PC1 for elites and PC1 for commoners on the same graph. Here's what we see. So the popular well-being is in green here, and elite overproduction is in red. And you can see that we see clear indications of a dynamical system, because notice that this one is based on 3 indicators, this one is based on 4 indicators, so which are separate. There is no crossover, there is no circularity involved in the data. The reason we see this particular oscillations is because our society is a social system, and it turns out all these indicators are connected through the dynamic feedbacks. So these periods when the red curve is high and green curve is low is when we have low well-being, so high population immiseration, and we have high elite overproduction and control. So these are the periods when we would expect to have high instability. And indeed, if we look at data, we see the following graph. It's a bit more complex than what we saw before, because if you look at the overall trend, right, ignoring these spikes for a moment, what we see is first the increase in indicators. So these are riots, lynchings, and terrorism. These riots are violent riots, which are they're only counted if at least one person has been killed. So instability events are events that result in lethal political violence. So I exclude here interpersonal crime like homicide rates, and also any kind of interstate collective violence. So this is collective violence focusing within the state, all right? And what we see here is general decrease in all indicators up to around 1820s. This is known as the era of good feelings, when the United States was in a particularly cooperative mood. Then increase and some fluctuations, all right? Okay, and then around 1920, we start seeing the decrease towards 1950, and then another increase since then. On top of this, what we call secular cycle, there is also a this 50-year spikes of violence. So the dynamical structure of this particular process is complex. There are at least 2 different periodicities. And remember, these are not strict cycles. These are periodicities resulting from feedbacks, and therefore they are not strictly periodical, but they are superimposed on each other. And this is not just, we see this pattern not just in the United States, it's actually a general pattern. I just don't have time to show it for other previous periods. It's actually wherever we have good data on political instability, we see these 2 waves, the secular wave and the 50-year cycle superimposed on it. That's a fairly standard pattern. I'll actually talk about in the next part about where it comes from. And so in this graph, if you basically look at how the instability relates to structural demographic pressures, which include both intra-elite competition and popular immiseration, there is actually a fairly strong positive correlation. Okay, so I have about 10 minutes left, and what I would like to do now, I would like to present to you So what I've been talking about before in this talk, this you can look for the details in Ages of Discord and some other publications. Now I want to shift gears and talk about the work we are doing now. So the idea is to try to use our understanding of why we see these ages of discord, why we see periods when social systems are particularly vulnerable to state breakdown, social breakdown, and other types of political instability. Obviously, because systems are nonlinear and complex, it would be naive to expect that we could make very accurate forecasts. Remember again, what I started with, my forecast was not really to predict the future, but rather test our understanding of how these ages of discord come about. So let's borrow a page from weather and climate forecasting. And so we call it multipath forecasting. And the basic idea is that we can use historical analysis, and specifically all the quantitative proxies that we can collect on a variety of past societies and also contemporary societies. And then build a computational model, or rather a suite of models, right? And then run these models forward to see what sort of trajectories are possible. And more importantly, we are interested in how different interventions, how do collective decisions at the level of societies, for example, resulting from successful social movements and resulting government actions, reforms, how they affect the trajectories. So the goal here is not really to predict the future, but rather to predict what would be good interventions that would result in better future rather than poor future. So the idea is similar to, let's say, hurricane forecasting. So here are a couple hurricanes and the possible multiple paths that they could take. So here that Sandy, for example, is right here now, just north of Jamaica, and climatologists run models, and it's a chaotic process. So it's you can see divergence of trajectories. In fact, some trajectories go way east, others go northwest. And so what we want to do is you want to quantify the frequency distribution of these things. Now with hurricanes, you cannot actually do much about affecting this trajectory, but with social systems, we may be able to do that. And here is historical data. If this is one particular hurricane, then here are a bunch of hurricanes for which we have data. So our idea is to gather massive historical database, we call it crisis DB, crisis database, on historical trajectories, refine models on that, and then take specific cases like the United States, for example, and try to use that understanding on a specific case. So the basic idea is our understanding suggests that if you have, actually it's multi-dimensional, but here I have just one dimension, like collective well-being. So collective well-being may be declining and there is no break points. It seems like a smooth decline. That's what we often see in the run-up to the crisis. And that's why it's nobody even believes that we are in a crisis situation until really bad things happen. But social pressures for crisis, so these represent the popular immiseration, elite overproduction, state fragility. They're actually increasing, all right? And at some point there is a break point, the system enters a revolutionary situation, and then depending on the actions and also on the initial conditions, you can have relatively positive things like recovery, rapid recovery, or outright collapse, or most of the time somewhere in between. So that's the basic, in caricature, that's the basic idea here. All right, so let me show you some current work on building this NPF model. And of course, we are nowhere near producing stochastic outcomes. So right now, I will be just showing some it's really a toy model at this point, or rather, it's a prototype. Let's think about it as a prototype, all right? So let's see how well it can do both as a microscope to look into the past, and also try to outline some trajectories for the future. So the model is very simple. It has really two inputs. One of them is, you've seen this slide, this is the relative wage. So relative wage is a major driver. It really is the pump. When the relative wage declines, the pump increasing the elite numbers and wealth increases, and that results after some time lag in inter-elite competition, which is really the most important engine of instability. All right, this one, you don't see it very well. Okay, this one is what we call youth vouchers. So what you see here is the relative change in the cohort of 15 to 24 people of 15 to 24 years of age. So think about it as 20s, people of 20, a little bit less than 20, a little bit more than 20. The question is, is that cohort increasing or declining relative to the overall population? And what you see, these are data and a smooth curve. So what you see is essentially a generation cycle here. And this big, huge peak is the baby boom cohort, which has become very numerous in around 1960s, during the 1960s. So this is also one of the drivers. As you see, as we shall see, it actually helps us explain some of the patterns we see. All right, so I'm not going to show you equations. You can see both components of the model, which looks at PSI, the political stress index, and essentially looking at epidemiological model, which I'll explain in a minute, just using this this graph. But the model is described in chapter 2 of Ages of Discord. At least the components are. Now we are putting them together in interesting ways. And as I said, it's very much work in process. Okay, complicated graph. So let me walk you through this. This brown line is relative wage. So we start at the level where relative wage is high, and therefore there is the pump that increases for social mobility for the elites is actually not operating. So the blue line is the relative elites. This is the number of elites relative to the population. And as you can see, it's not changing because the pump is not operating. However, as we know historically from 1830s, the relative wage has declined. So here I introduce that turns on the pump, and now we have more and more elites increasing. So at this point, we have actually in high political stress index, because we have elite overproduction, too many elites for the population, and also we have the popular immiseration, here purely expressed in economic terms. So this red line is that political stress index. It's essentially a measure of how fragile political situation is. All right, let's look at these two other curves. This is the epidemiological part. So essentially, in order for a revolution to happen or to have civil war or everything, we need some radicalized part of the population. So this purple curve is the number of radicals in the population. So during this period when the political stress index was low, the rate of radicalization is very low, and so they are declining, all right? But now that PSI has started growing, that we see greater increase in the numbers of this radicalized population. So this is the peak when we see a lot of political instability, because these are the people who perpetrate such acts. But what happens is that, and this is where the 50-year cycle comes from, is that people get tired of instability. And so at some point, many of the former radicals, well, some of them get killed or arrested or whatever, but most of them, the more important factor is that they become disenchanted with radicalism, and so they turn into what you call here moderates. This is the black curve, and the moderates exhibit moderating influence, and as a result of that, we see actually the suppression of radical population and a suppression of the general instability. But then the moderates live only so long, then they die out or retire. And that actually allows the next, because the conditions, see this, the conditions, the pump is still there. So here some elites have been driven down. So here, for example, in the United States, during the 1860s, what happened was the ruling class, the slave owners, they got basically disenfranchised, and that's why the blue curve has declined. All right, so basically, if the conditions, the pump continues to operate, then you have another peak and so on and so forth. But that's not what happened in the reality. And this 50-year cycle is basically bi-generational cycle. When people who have experienced civil war die out, that allows the new naive population to radicalize. So what actually happened was that as a result of this instability, there were reforms taken during the early part of the 20th century, and relative wage has increased back to the equilibrium thing. And so there was the first peak, second peak, and then things have stabilized. This part is entirely driven by that youth bulge, huge youth bulge resulting from the baby boomers. All right, so let's take a look at, so this is the predicted PSI, political stress index from the model. If we superimpose data that I have shown you, but now I show you just the overall data on political instability, and I superimpose the PSI, we see that it seems to work reasonably well as a slightly advanced indicator of instability in data. Of course, the model parameters, there is not a huge number of them, about half a dozen, but they were fitted so that we would get nice picture of this. This is retrodiction, not even true retrodiction, because I am essentially using the historical data to refine the model and get its parameters. So let's see what happens if we use the model for the future. So here we are, here's the slight peak of 1960s, right? All these radicals have declined. Now, as a result of the decrease in relative wage that we saw, this is the historically one which started in 1970s and gradually declined. Now we see the same situation. So here is 2020. This is where we are now. And what this graph says that we still have between 5 and 10 years of instability, because it takes a while for these peaks to decline. And if we don't take any actions, then you'll have another huge peak about 50 years later of instability, and then it will go forever. And this part here, even though it will be relatively peaceful at this point, but still you'll have elevated PSI, and basically it will not be a nice place, nice time to live in the United States. So what we need to do, we need to bring this back up. And so this has not happened at all. So this is the optimistic scenario. Suppose this administration comes in and realizes what happens and starts bring the relative wage up. Then what will happen, we'll still have, it's too late now, there's too much inertia in the system, but at least we'll avoid the peak after all. Again, I just repeat that this is still it's a prototype. It's essentially, we are exploring how to build these types of models, and also how to do it for other societies, not just the United States, and also how to turn it essentially eventually into a policy tool. And my time is up, and so therefore I will stop here. And thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Gosh, there's so many challenging ideas, especially of what we're living today, in the last few months, that going back in history over the last 100 or even 200 years and watch, these trends is really fascinating for many of us, at least in the hard sciences. Well, we have some time because even though our time is up, we have about 7 or 8 minutes shorter time in the next session. So we have extra 5 minutes now. So it is now open for questions.
Yes, happy to respond to any questions.
Let's see if there's a chat. Can you read the chat, Peter?
Let me load it. Let's see.
What will happen if the real wage will be lower than now? This is one question.
If you don't mind, just choose a question. If there's a question from the chat, choose one and read it for me. Because I forgot how to get to chat, to tell you the truth. Yes, I can't find the button for chat. Sorry.
Can I read it for you?
Yes, please do. That would be best.
Okay. Can you reconcile your macroscopic perspective with a more granular model?
Yes, we are very interested in the micro to macro connection. So I work with Sergei Gavrilets on these types of issues. So what I showed you obviously is all macro. There are no individuals here. We do have, the population is divided into various segments, such as workers, elites, radicalized moderates, and so on and so forth. But the development of actual revolutions and civil wars, it resembles, earthquakes or forest fires. There's got to be a spark, and this spark is typically some individual action. So, for example, the Arab Spring was brought by the self-immolation of that now famous, sadly famous fruit vendor. And so what we need to do is in order to connect this model to more fine-grained, both in terms of individuals and in terms of time periods. So instead of looking at years, right, or decades, you want to look at what's happening on days and weeks. You have to connect it to micro models. And this is a very fascinating project, obviously, because the big question is, we have a spark, and then let's say a riot, it starts to explode, but then most riots die out without leading anywhere. But some riots now take over. So obviously, in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement was a result of such a spark. But what's interesting, of course, the United States cops have killed lots of people, black people, white people, and so on and so forth. But it was the James Floyd's death that triggered this event. So here we see a translation of micro level events into macro level conflagration. And we are only in very early stages, in fact, of the investigation. And so it would be great if other people would join in. And of course, social scientists have done a lot of work on this, on this micro to macro connection in political violence events specifically.
Okay, there's another question on related to climate change. How about big socioeconomic transformation in the next decades to tackle the climate change? Do you think that these are more likely because of the political climate that you forecast?
First of all, climate change, but also epidemics, those are factors that we have a lot of historical data on. They've been major exogenous factors. So for example, if you think about the Black Death spread, for Europe, it was an exogenous event. It came from Central Asia. It has had a huge effect on social system, and it helped to bring about the crisis of late Middle Ages. So what we see today with COVID-19 epidemic is another one. It's not in the model. All right, so that's another thing we should do. But in climate change too, climate change affects the system by, for example, increasing food prices. So if the question is about how does this dynamic help or not help, our collective solutions for climate change, unfortunately, it doesn't help, because when we see this radicalization that we see here, there's not just one single radical party. These individuals are broken into several warring parties, typically 2, 3, actually many of them. So this means that during this period, when a situation is radicalized, the cooperation goes down. So ability to solve collective problems actually declines. And this is why we are actually not, well, we see that basically. The two, the Republican Party in the United States, for example, is anti-climate change. They don't want to do anything about it. And because of the hugely polarized situation, the ability of the United States, for example, to contribute to positive solutions is highly limited. So this type of dynamics, by decreasing cooperation at the level of society, actually decrease our ability to deal with collective challenges.
Okay, good. There's a question that going all throughout your transparencies comes about the quality of the data. How about the data from 1700s or 1800s compared quality-wise with the data of 2020? And in order to make a comparison that you have made in the same graph, how much uncertainty does one have for the early time data?
So first of all, in terms of transparency, Crisis DB data will be available as soon as we have collected and done some preliminary analysis. We publish the project, the SESHAT project, which Crisis DB is part of, has committed to open sharing of the data. So as soon as we submit the paper, what we do, we publish the paper as a preprint, and we publish the data. So everybody can examine our data. In terms of questions of accuracy, obviously, as you go back into the past, first of all, the record becomes much more gappy. The whole variables are missing. Sometimes you have wages data, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have data on wealth and incomes, and sometimes you don't. And the farther you go back in time, the less and less such information is available. But in principle, there are statistical methods. So the trick is to make sure that you don't overinterpret your data. You want the uncertainty measures to percolate all the way from the data into your results. And in the SESHAT project, we use a variety of such approaches. We use multiple imputation for missing data, and we use bootstrap and other types of approaches to properly characterize the distribution of answers, so to speak. I would be very interested in connecting with a good Bayesian statistician. I'm not technically savvy enough to do that, but this type of approach just asks for Bayesian methodologies. So I'm probably talking too long, but to cut the long story short, modern statistical methods allow us to translate the uncertainty at the level of data into uncertainty at the level of statistics we get from analysis. Mm-hmm. And again, we post all the scripts, R scripts, for example, together with data, so others can examine them and improve on them, or find errors, which would be also fine.
Okay, Peter, there's a lot of other questions. We just don't have time for all of them. It was very exciting, and not the run-of-the-mill type of talk that we